Okay, so now we're going to talk about a very important part of TOGAF, which is governance. And it's one of the things that makes the framework special because it puts it right up there. Because without governance, you can't achieve success with your architecture method, no matter how wonderful it is. So TOGAF's architecture development method is world famous. It's used by 170 countries around the world at least. TOGAF, because of its ADM, has been translated into multiple languages. My own organization has translated it into 5 languages. So it's very, very popular. But without governance, it just won't work. And so we want to spend a little bit of time saying, what does TOGAF offer about governance in general and how it applies in particular to the ADM and how it's integrated with the ADM. For one thing, in the preliminary phase, we need to set up governance. And part of governance is having an architecture board. That architecture board would be the overseer of the whole ADM program to make sure it's properly executed and that the ADM is being applied correctly across all phases of an architecture development cycle. Compliance to the ADM is fundamental to the governance of the architecture to ensure that all considerations are made and all required deliverables are produced as laid out, for example, then in phase A, where you have a statement of architecture work that says here are all the reports we're going to do with all the visuals we're going to create and so on. So that's in effect a contract and in service of the architecture board. In support of ADM governance, we would need to have some kind of governance repository. We talked about an architecture repository earlier, talked about inside of it, it had architecture landscape, it had a reference library, we talked about it had standards. We didn't mention that it also has a governance log. That's an important part of an architecture repository. But overall, for ADM governance, we need to track reference data, which is used for guidance and instruction during project implementation. This reference data would also include a description of the governance procedures themselves, such as how we're going to do a compliance review. Also, we would have process status. All information regarding the state of any governance process would also be managed. For example, the architecture board would say, I want to have an architecture compliance review process and I want it managed in the following ways. If there's certain projects over X amount of dollars, I want to have a formal review. If it's not over that amount and not significant, then I just want the information posted for possible auditing. So that's the type of thing that the overarching architectural governance body would be looking for and want to be tracking in the repository. Audit information is a particularly important part of supporting ADM governance. Audit information would record all completed governance process actions. It could be used to support key decisions and responsible personnel for any architecture project that has been sanctioned by the governance process. Of course, audit information would also serve as a reference for any future architectural and supporting process developments, guidance, etc. Now, regarding scope, there are many elements requiring limits to the scope of architectural activity. This ties into architectural governance as well, because if you don't have the authority to be involved with a certain transformational aspect or project, well then of course you shouldn't be provided any resources to do that. So the organizational authority of the team is going to be dictated by the architecture board, in fact, and usually through a charter. So that's one major constraint, is the organization authority. The other would be the objectives and stakeholder concerns that would be addressed within an architecture program, and the availability of people, finance, and other resources would also be a limiting element in terms of what scope your architecture activity has. The scope chosen for the architecture activity should ideally allow for the work of all architects within the enterprise to be effectively governed and integrated. Now, one could extend this further, as Harley-Davidson did, to say that we also want to govern all architecture work done by our contractors and vendors. So one can certainly do that as well. The scope chosen should also ensure architects are not working on duplicate or conflicting activities. So one should be providing transparency and better communication through properly governed scope. And finally, it should clearly define reuse and compliance relationships between different parts of the architecture work being done in an enterprise. There are four dimensions typically used in order to define and limit the scope of an architecture. We talked earlier about BDAT. We talked about that meaning business, data, application, and technology. Those are the four domains that we use to organize the architectures in TOGAF. We also talked about, for iterations, that we could look at BDAT. We could look at the breadth, the depth, and the time, and that could affect to what degree we would look at which architecture domains. Similarly, when we're scoping an architecture activity, we have to consider the same type of BDAT. The breadth, what is the full extent of the enterprise, and what part of that extent will this architecting effort deal with? The depth, to what level of detail should the architecture effort go? Time period, just take that out of sequence a little bit for the T, but what is the time period that needs to be articulated for the architecture vision? And then for architecture domains, our A element, do time and resource constraints preclude a top-down, all-inclusive architecture description for all four architecture domains? If not, then we have to constrain our scope to the ones for which we have the time and resources to complete. So we've spoken about the importance of architectural governance and how TOGAF includes governance as a key aspect of its architecture capability framework, which we need in order to develop the method, the architecture development method. So governance is extremely important. TOGAF does us a great service by bringing this topic up and helping to clarify what governance is in terms of control, transparency, accountability. We talked about how we have to set up a board, and that architecture board would be controlling the method and also any sub-boards underneath it, and how we have to manage the work in all the domains. We also have to govern the scoping, and so that we're not conflicting with other architecture work that's being done, and that we're only doing architecture work in the areas for which we have authority to do architecture work. So this is a very critical aspect, but one thing I'd like you to take away from governance is that not only is it super critical to have governance as part of the framework and to enable success with the ADM, it's often misperceived as being over controlling and maybe a reason not even to do an EA framework such as TOGAF, because you're saying, oh, you're going to hurt our innovation, you're going to be trying to stop us. So it's very important as part of governance to think about the communication aspects and how to do your branding and how to lay out in an all-inclusive way that this is, the EA is everybody's discipline. It's not just the purview of the architects. So it's a cross-cutting enterprise. It's a collaborative planning. So how you facilitate that through effective governance is very important. So governance is in fact a kind of a glue to ensure that the ADM is more successful. So it's not just by being a compliance process, but also by being a communication process that governance will succeed.